What if everything you thought was going smoothly on a flight suddenly turned into a nightmare just because of one mistake? A black woman asks to take her seat in first class, but the flight attendant refuses. 8 minutes later, that decision cost someone everything. You won't believe what happened next. Before we get started, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. And if you like the story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more. Olivia had been looking forward to this flight. It was supposed to be an easy trip from New York to Los Angeles, a chance to rest and catch up on work after a long week of meetings. She had booked her seat weeks in advance, paying extra for first class, expecting a little comfort during the flight. The boarding process was typical, with the usual rush of passengers trying to find their seats and get settled. Olivia, with her boarding pass in hand, confidently walked through the aisle of the airplane toward her assigned seat in first class. As she reached the row, she noticed the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s, standing at the front of the cabin, checking the seating arrangements. Olivia smiled at her, ready to settle in for the long flight. But as she approached her seat, the flight attendant stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her tone firm but polite. "That seat is for someone else. I need you to sit in another seat." Olivia paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. She looked at the boarding pass again, verifying the seat number. "I think there's a mistake. This is my seat. See, I've got my ticket here, first class, row 2A, she explained calmly, offering her ticket for the flight attendant to look at. The flight attendant glanced down at the ticket, then back at Olivia, her expression turning colder. "I'm sorry, but this seat is reserved for another passenger. You'll need to move to a different one." Olivia was taken aback. "I don't understand. My ticket clearly says this is my seat. Are you sure there isn't a mistake?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even, though she was starting to feel a knot of unease in her stomach. She had flown first class many times before, and there had never been an issue with the seat arrangements. But the flight attendant was unmoved. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to sit in another seat." Her voice was polite, but there was a certain finality to it, as if Olivia had no choice in the matter. Olivia stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She was trying to remain calm, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some of them looking at her with mild curiosity, others glancing at the flight attendant in confusion. Olivia's patience was wearing thin, but she didn't want to cause a scene. She just wanted to get settled and move on with her flight. "Is there someone else I can speak to?" Olivia asked, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't about to back down, not without some kind of explanation. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her options. Then, with a quick nod, she stepped aside and gestured to a nearby senior flight attendant who was walking down the aisle. The senior attendant, a man in his late 40s, approached Olivia with a neutral expression. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone professional. "This seat is reserved for someone else," the first flight attendant explained quickly, pointing at Olivia's seat. "I told her she can't sit here." Olivia tried to stay calm. "This is my seat according to my boarding pass. I've been flying for years and this has never happened before. Can you please check again?" The senior attendant looked at the boarding pass, then at Olivia. He seemed to hesitate for a second. Olivia couldn't help but feel a rising sense of frustration. She wasn't a confrontational person, but she had never experienced anything like this before. "I'll check with the captain," the senior attendant said, before walking off toward the cockpit area. As Olivia waited, standing in the aisle with her bag still slung over her shoulder, she began to notice the stares of the other passengers. Some of them were trying to be discreet, glancing over at her, while others were openly watching the exchange. It was clear to Olivia that something wasn't right. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew this wasn't just a simple mistake. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant returned, but this time his expression had changed. There was a hint of tension in his face, as though he was unsure how to handle the situation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the confusion," he said, though his voice didn't sound as apologetic as it should have. "There's been a misunderstanding, and I need you to move to a different seat." Olivia could feel her heart pounding in her chest now. Something was off. She had heard of airlines having issues before, but this felt different. It felt personal. The way the flight attendants were acting, the way they were speaking to her. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. With every moment that passed, Olivia's unease grew. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being singled out. Why was this happening? What was really going on here? Olivia knew she had to stay calm, but it was becoming more and more difficult to ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. Something was about to unfold, and she had no idea how much it would change everything. Just a few more minutes passed, but they felt like hours. As Olivia waited for an answer, she tried to stay focused on the situation at hand, but deep down, she knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The tension in the cabin seemed to grow with every passing minute. Olivia stood there trying to hold her ground, but she could feel the weight of the eyes around her. Some passengers were openly watching, others pretending not to notice, but the uncomfortable silence was unmistakable. She glanced down the aisle at the other first-class passengers, all of them seated and relaxed, none of them seeming to care about the exchange that was unfolding. But Olivia wasn't just anyone. She had always prided herself on being polite and patient, but this was different. As the senior flight attendant walked away again, Olivia couldn't help but wonder, why was this happening to me? The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. Was it because she was a black woman in first class? Had the flight attendant assumed she didn't belong there? She had seen and heard enough about the bias and discrimination that often went unnoticed or ignored in situations like this. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the flight attendant wasn't just refusing her seat. It felt personal. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant returned, this time with the flight captain. Olivia wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or even more worried. The captain looked at Olivia's ticket, then at the flight attendant, and for a moment he didn't say anything. He seemed to be waiting for the right moment to speak, and Olivia could feel the air grow thick with the unspoken tension. "Ma'am," the captain said, finally breaking the silence. "We've had a situation come up. Your seat was mistakenly given to another passenger who hasn't boarded yet, and we're trying to sort it out. In the meantime, we need you to sit in a different seat." Olivia stared at him, still trying to process what he was saying. It didn't make sense. How could a mistake like this happen with a confirmed first-class seat? She could feel her patience wearing thin, but she didn't want to escalate things further. She needed answers. And fast. "I've paid for this seat. I've been traveling for years and I know how this works. I'm not moving until I understand exactly what's going on," Olivia said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the frustration creeping in. The flight attendant and the captain exchanged a quick look, and for the first time, Olivia noticed the unease on their faces. It was as if they were unsure how to handle her. She could tell they weren't used to passengers pushing back in this way. But Olivia wasn't about to back down. She wasn't going to let this situation slide without getting a clear answer. The captain seemed to hesitate, then nodded towards the flight attendant. "We'll sort this out, ma'am. Please remain seated for just a few more minutes," he said, his voice more reassuring now. But something about his tone felt off. It was like he was trying to avoid something, and Olivia wasn't sure what. As Olivia sat down in a nearby seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just being asked to move because of a mistake. There was something deeper going on, and she wasn't sure whether it was a misunderstanding or something else entirely. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. She wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but in that moment, everything felt wrong. The minutes stretched on, and Olivia kept looking up, watching the flight attendants whispering among themselves at the front of the cabin. She could sense that the situation was spiraling into something bigger than she could have imagined. She had no idea where this was going, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a simple case of mistaken seating. It was becoming something more, something Olivia wasn't ready to face. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, the captain walked back down the aisle toward Olivia. His face was serious, but there was no trace of the calm reassurance he had tried to offer earlier. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake," he began, his voice lower now, almost apologetic. "But we've had a change of plans. The flight attendant—" He paused for a moment, glancing at the flight attendant standing beside him. Without warning, he added, "She'll be leaving the flight." Olivia blinked in confusion. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The flight attendant, the same one who had refused her seat, was being removed from the flight? Her mind raced. What did that mean? The captain quickly added, "We've come to a decision. You'll be getting your seat back shortly, and we'll be taking care of the situation." But Olivia could barely process his words. As the captain turned and walked away, she was left in stunned silence. The flight attendant who had caused all of this was being escorted off the plane. Just like that. It had only been a few minutes, but Olivia felt as though everything had changed in the blink of an eye. She had come onto this flight expecting nothing more than a peaceful journey, but instead, she found herself caught in the middle of something that seemed to be unraveling with every moment that passed. And now, as the situation unfolded, she realized that it wasn't just about her seat anymore. Something much bigger was at play. As Olivia sat there, processing what had just happened, a strange sense of disbelief washed over her. The minutes dragged on, but she remained frozen in her seat, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. The senior flight attendant, who had been the one to bring the captain into the mix, returned to the front of the cabin. He wasn't looking directly at Olivia, but she could feel his eyes lingering for just a moment as he passed by. The awkwardness was palpable. It didn't take long for Olivia to realize that the situation was far from over. The flight attendants were still whispering to each other, exchanging furtive glances. Whatever had just occurred was clearly more serious than a simple misunderstanding. There was a ripple of tension among the crew, and Olivia couldn't help but wonder how far this would go. Was this just a mistake that had been blown out of proportion? Or had there been something else at play, something much darker? Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over. She thought about the way Sarah, the first flight attendant, had blocked her from her seat, the coldness in her voice, the way she had insisted that Olivia move, without even bothering to check the ticket properly. Olivia had been on flights countless times, but never had she felt so singled out, so unwanted in a space she had paid for. In a way, she knew this wasn't just a random mistake. It felt like an assumption had been made based on her appearance, and that assumption had cost someone their job. The plane began to fill with the usual buzz of activity as the rest of the passengers settled in. Olivia noticed a few passengers turning their heads in her direction, still trying to gauge the situation, but nobody spoke up. It was clear that the other passengers had no idea what had just transpired, and Olivia wasn't sure if she wanted to make it known. She didn't want to be seen as the cause of any further disruption, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that what had just happened wasn't just about her or her seat. It was about something bigger, a breakdown in the way people were treated, simply because of who they were. Eventually, the plane doors were closed, and the flight was ready to take off. Olivia still hadn't moved from her seat. The air felt thick with uncertainty, and she could tell that the crew was trying to act as though everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. As the plane began its descent down the runway, Olivia sat in her seat staring out the window, her thoughts racing. Then, as the plane lifted off the ground, the flight attendant, Sarah, returned, but this time she wasn't carrying her usual tray of drinks or snacks. She was holding a clipboard, her expression downcast. Olivia's stomach dropped as soon as she saw her. She had expected Sarah to return, but not like this. Without saying a word, Sarah walked up the aisle and stood at the front of the cabin, where the senior attendant and the captain had been speaking earlier. The moment she stepped into view, Olivia knew something had changed. The tension was unbearable now. Olivia felt a sharp pang of curiosity mixed with dread. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know what was coming next, but deep down she knew it wasn't going to be good. Sarah stopped at the front of the cabin and handed the clipboard to the senior flight attendant. There was a brief exchange, too quiet for Olivia to overhear, but the look on Sarah's face said it all. She was being dismissed, and this time there was no room for negotiation. She wasn't just being moved or reassigned. This wasn't a simple mistake that could be swept under the rug. For a long moment, the entire cabin seemed to fall into a strange silence, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. The captain stood by, his arms crossed, watching the situation unfold. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, the senior flight attendant turned to Olivia and addressed her directly. "Ma'am, the issue has been resolved. You will have your seat back in just a moment," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. He paused for a second, then added, "Unfortunately, there's been a more serious matter. We've had to take some action regarding the flight attendant who caused the confusion." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The gravity of the situation was only just beginning to sink in. She hadn't expected anything like this. She had thought maybe Sarah would apologize and things would return to normal. But instead, Olivia was faced with a reality that was much harder to accept. The senior flight attendant continued, "We've had to make a difficult decision. Sarah will be leaving the plane. Her conduct is not in line with our standards." Olivia was stunned. She had never expected this outcome. She wasn't sure how to react. Part of her felt relieved that the flight crew was finally taking responsibility for the situation, but another part of her felt guilty. Sarah's mistake had cost her everything, and it was hard for Olivia to ignore the fact that this entire situation had started because of a simple refusal, an assumption made about her that was completely unfounded. As Sarah began to gather her things, Olivia couldn't help but watch. She didn't feel joy or satisfaction. Instead, she felt a quiet, unsettling sense of loss. She had stood her ground, and now an entire career was being ripped away in front of her eyes. But it wasn't just about the career. It was about everything that had led up to this moment, the assumptions, the biases, and the consequences that followed. As Sarah walked down the aisle, Olivia could see the embarrassment written all over her face. There were no words exchanged between them, no apology, just the cold, hard truth. One mistake had changed everything, and in the end, it was Olivia who had been left with the weight of that decision. Olivia sat back in her seat, trying to process the whirlwind of events. The plane was in the air now, cruising toward its destination, but it felt as though time had frozen for her. The flight attendants had resumed their duties, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the air around her was still thick with the aftermath of what had just happened. Sarah, the flight attendant who had refused her first-class seat, was now gone, and yet Olivia still couldn't believe the speed at which everything had unfolded. As the plane settled into its routine, with the seatbelt sign switched off and passengers stretching in their seats, Olivia couldn't help but replay the entire exchange in her mind. She kept thinking about how everything had started with just a simple question. Is this seat available? A question that should have been met with a simple yes, but instead had spiraled into something far beyond her control. She thought back to the initial refusal, how Sarah had looked at her with that cold, dismissive gaze, as though Olivia didn't belong in the space she had paid for. The assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly be in first class. It was a look Olivia had seen before, though never in such a glaring, open way. And it wasn't just about the seat. It was about the tone, the immediate dismissal, the way Sarah had acted as if Olivia's presence was an inconvenience. As the flight continued, Olivia felt an unsettling mix of emotions. Relief, yes, that the issue was finally over, but also something else she couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps. She didn't want anyone to lose their job over something like this. She hadn't asked for Sarah to be fired. All she had wanted was a simple resolution. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Sarah's actions had gone far beyond a simple mistake. Her refusal wasn't just about a seat. It was about judgment, about assumptions based on race and class, things Olivia had learned to navigate but never quite get used to. Olivia had worked hard to get to where she was in life, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all a flight attendant, make her feel less than anyone else. But seeing Sarah escorted off the plane like that made Olivia question everything. Was she wrong for standing up for herself? Was it right that Sarah had lost her job? Could the situation have been handled differently? For the rest of the flight, Olivia tried to focus on her work, opening up her laptop and attempting to distract herself with emails and reports. But her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened. She could feel the stares from the passengers, though many were trying to pretend like nothing had occurred. Some were still whispering, some watching the cabin crew, trying to piece together what had happened. Olivia couldn't help but feel like an outsider, even though she had been there first. She had done everything right. She had followed the rules, paid for the seat, and expected to have a simple, uneventful flight. But in that moment, she felt like the very thing she had fought for, the fairness, the respect, had been stripped away. The flight attendants seemed to be on edge now, walking the aisle with a nervous energy that Olivia hadn't noticed before. They exchanged quiet glances, and though they continued with their duties, their movements were less fluid, less confident. Olivia couldn't help but wonder if they were all just as shaken by what had happened as she was. Did they know what had really caused the fallout? Or were they just going through the motions, trying to keep things from escalating further? For the first time in a long while, Olivia felt completely out of place, even in a space she had paid for. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the larger, deeper issue that had led to this moment. It was about bias, about how easy it was for someone to assume that she didn't belong, even when she had every right to be there. She glanced over at the now empty space where Sarah had been standing just moments ago. A part of her felt a pang of sympathy. It wasn't that Olivia wanted Sarah to lose her job. It wasn't about revenge. But another part of her understood the consequences of actions like this. Biases, whether intentional or not, had consequences, and sometimes those consequences were unavoidable. Olivia had fought hard to be where she was, to break through barriers, and she knew that the journey hadn't been easy. She couldn't imagine how much harder it must have been for someone like Sarah, who might not have even realized the weight of her actions until it was too late. As the flight continued, Olivia's thoughts turned inward. She realized that, in a way, she had become a part of something larger. This wasn't just a random encounter. It wasn't just a mistake by one person. It was a reflection of the subtle, insidious ways that biases and assumptions could shape people's lives. Olivia had stood up for herself because, in that moment, she had felt she had no other choice. But she also knew that standing up for herself had meant something bigger. It had meant confronting the discomfort that comes with challenging the status quo, and that was something Sarah hadn't been prepared for. Olivia looked out the window, watching the clouds roll by, her thoughts swirling just as quickly. The flight had taken on a new meaning now. It wasn't just about getting to her destination. It was about understanding how easily the dynamics of power, privilege, and race could change in an instant. It was about realizing that even small actions could have lasting effects, and sometimes those actions came with a price. By the time the plane was descending toward Los Angeles, Olivia's mind had slowed down. She had processed the events of the flight, and though she still didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for certain. Things had changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. And in a strange way, she felt a small sense of power in that. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about speaking up when something wasn't right, even when it was uncomfortable. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign flashed back on, Olivia gathered her things, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. She didn't have to have all the answers right now, but one thing was clear. She had made a stand, and that was something she could be proud of. As the plane taxied to the gate, Olivia felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering discomfort. The flight had seemed to drag on, each passing minute forcing her to reconsider the events that had transpired. She was eager to disembark and move past it all, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavily over her. The other passengers began to gather their belongings, chatting quietly as they prepared to leave. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the whole cabin was caught in the shadow of what had unfolded. She wasn't sure what she expected next, but she didn't anticipate the attention that came when the flight finally reached the gate. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers started to get up, Olivia noticed that some of them were giving her subtle glances. A few faces seemed familiar now, as if they had been watching her through the whole ordeal. She felt exposed, though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She had only asked for her seat, the seat she had paid for. And yet somehow she had become part of a bigger narrative that wasn't entirely her own. She was now a symbol of something, though she wasn't sure exactly what that something was. The moment the plane doors opened, Olivia stood up, grabbed her bag, and made her way toward the exit. The familiar feeling of stepping onto solid ground should have been comforting, but it wasn't. She could feel the weight of the story still hanging over her. As she walked down the jet bridge, she briefly wondered if Sarah was still somewhere on the plane, packing her things in silence, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. Olivia hadn't seen her leave the plane. She had been escorted off in such a quiet, hurried manner that Olivia hadn't had time to process it. But the thought of Sarah facing the consequences of her actions made Olivia pause. Was it fair that she had lost her job? She wasn't sure. She didn't know what had happened behind the scenes, what discussions had been held before the decision was made. She tried to push those thoughts away as she stepped into the airport terminal, her feet carrying her toward the baggage claim area. She was ready to get on with her day, to forget the tension, the anxiety, the uncomfortable feeling of being under a microscope. But the more she walked, the more the truth settled in. It wasn't just the seat that had been the issue. It was the assumption, the subtle discrimination that had driven the entire incident. And now, even though it was over, it felt like a part of her would never be able to forget it. As she waited for her luggage, Olivia's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a notification from social media, something she had been trying to avoid all day. The headline caught her eye immediately. Flight attendant fired after refusing black passenger first-class seat. Her stomach tightened. She had known that something like this might happen. Her experience had become something bigger, something that would likely spread far beyond the confines of this flight. As she scrolled through the post, she saw comments flooding in, some supportive, others critical. The opinions varied wildly, but the one thing they all had in common was the way they framed the situation. Some people were calling Olivia a hero for standing up for herself, while others were questioning whether Sarah's firing was justified. There were others who seemed to miss the point entirely, turning it into a debate about whether first-class privileges should be reserved for those who deserve them. But the more she read, the more Olivia realized that the story was no longer just about her, or even Sarah. It had become a larger conversation, one that touched on race, class, and the hidden biases that shaped people's actions, even in spaces like a first-class cabin. As she stood there waiting for her bag to appear on the carousel, Olivia's thoughts turned inward once more. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much deeper. She had stood up for herself because she believed in fairness. But it seemed that the system didn't always work in her favor. Even when she did everything right, even when she was the one who had been wronged, it was still her actions that were being scrutinized. She wasn't just a passenger on a flight. She had become a representative of something far larger than herself. The issue of bias, of inequality, had followed her off the plane and onto the pages of every news outlet and social media feed. She sighed, trying to clear her head. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the fallout, for the attention that was sure to follow. But one thing was certain. Her life had been irrevocably changed by this incident. And no matter what happened next, Olivia knew that she couldn't just walk away from it. She couldn't pretend that this wasn't part of a much larger conversation that needed to be had. She had been part of something much bigger than herself, and whether she liked it or not, that was the reality she had to face now. When her luggage finally appeared on the belt, She grabbed it and made her way toward the exit, trying to shake off the weight of the last few hours. But she couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just an isolated story. It was a reminder of the things that so often went unnoticed, the subtle ways in which bias and discrimination could manifest, and how one small moment could have lasting, far-reaching effects. As she stepped out into the busy terminal, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. Olivia didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was part of a much larger movement now, one that would continue to challenge and confront the biases that shaped the world around her. And whether she was ready for it or not, she was going to have to face whatever came next. As Olivia made her way through the airport, the weight of the day seemed to press down on her with every step. She had hoped that once the flight ended, so would the tension, but reality had other plans. Her phone buzzed again, another notification, this time from a news app. The headline was blunt. Flight attendant fired after incident with black passenger. Video goes viral. Olivia's stomach twisted. A video? She hesitated for a moment, then clicked on the link. The video opened with shaky footage from a passenger's phone. It was blurry, but Olivia could make out her own face in the frame. The video was a close-up of her conversation with Sarah, the flight attendant, just before the situation had spiraled out of control. The sound was muffled, but you could clearly see Sarah's stern expression as she spoke, her posture tense. It was a brief clip, but the comments were already flooding in. Many focused on the moment Sarah had refused Olivia the seat. Some people were siding with Olivia, while others argued the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. The comments were overwhelmingly focused on one thing. Why had the flight attendant been so quick to dismiss Olivia? Olivia's hands tightened around her phone as she scrolled through the comments. Some were supportive, praising her for standing up for herself. Others were questioning her actions, asking if she had overreacted or if she was just trying to stir up trouble. A few even hinted that she had gotten the flight attendant fired on purpose. Olivia's heart sank. The video, which was meant to capture the moment she stood up for herself, had turned into a battleground of opinions. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about race, privilege, and assumptions. And now, her name was attached to all of it. She felt a mix of anger and frustration bubbling up inside her. She had done nothing wrong. All she wanted was to sit in the seat she had paid for. But now the entire situation was being dissected, analyzed, and judged in ways she couldn't control. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be the face of this story, but it seemed like there was no turning back. The video was out there, and it was spreading fast. As she approached the airport exit, she noticed a group of people standing near the security checkpoint, their phones pointed in her direction. She froze for a moment, a cold rush of anxiety hitting her. Were they filming her now? Were they waiting for her to react? She quickly turned her head, trying to avoid any attention, but it was clear that the story was bigger than she had expected. She had become part of something much larger, a conversation she hadn't asked for, but that she would now have to confront. She needed to get out of the airport, to find some space where she could think clearly without the pressure of 1,000 eyes on her. But deep down, she knew she couldn't escape the truth. She couldn't escape the conversation that was now unfolding, one that would follow her long after she left the terminal. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The video had already gone viral, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. She wasn't sure where this would all lead, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same after today. Olivia spent the next few days trying to get back to her normal routine, but it was impossible to avoid the impact of the viral video. Every time she picked up her phone, there was another notification, another article, another opinion. The story had made its way onto major news outlets, social media feeds, and even talk shows. It was no longer just about an incident on a flight. It had become a national conversation about race, privilege, and the ways in which people are treated based on assumptions. Her name was everywhere. Some people were calling her brave for standing up to the flight attendant, while others were accusing her of stirring up drama. Olivia had never expected to become a focal point for such a sensitive issue. But now that it was out there was no hiding from it. Her inbox was filled with messages, some from strangers offering support, others from people criticizing her for not handling the situation differently. She found herself reading the messages late into the night, each one a reflection of the divided opinions on the matter. But what unsettled her the most were the messages from people who seemed to misunderstand her entirely, accusing her of seeking attention or inflating the situation for personal gain. Some even insinuated that she had played a role in getting Sarah fired. Olivia had never intended for any of this to happen. She didn't want to see someone lose their job over a misunderstanding. She hadn't wanted to be the subject of a viral story, to become the face of a much larger discussion about systemic issues. She had simply wanted to sit in the seat she had paid for, without being treated differently. But the truth was, the incident had sparked something deeper, a conversation that, whether she was ready for it or not, was now part of her life. As the days passed, she began to see the true impact of what had happened. People were talking about the biases that existed in everyday life, in places like airports, restaurants, and even planes. Olivia wasn't just a passenger who had been wronged. She had become a catalyst for a conversation that needed to happen. Though she felt overwhelmed, part of her also understood that she couldn't just walk away from this. The story wasn't just about her. It was about a larger issue, about the ways people of color, particularly Black women, were treated in public spaces. It was about how bias could show up in the most mundane moments, and how those moments could snowball into something much more serious. Olivia found herself reflecting more and more on her own experiences, the subtle ways she had been made to feel othered throughout her life. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about all the little moments where she had been overlooked, underestimated, or unfairly judged. This wasn't just Sarah's problem. It was a societal problem. And now Olivia found herself at the center of it, whether she was ready or not. As the story continued to unfold in the media, Olivia knew that her part in it wasn't over. There would be interviews, more articles, more discussions. And through it all, she realized that the real story was not just about a flight attendant losing her job. It was about how one moment in time could highlight a much larger issue, one that needed to be addressed head-on. Olivia didn't know where this would lead, but she was starting to understand that her voice, her experience, could be a part of the change that was beginning to unfold. As the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding Olivia's incident didn't die down. If anything, it was gaining more steam. News outlets and social media were still buzzing with debate over the situation. Articles were written questioning whether Sarah's firing had been justified, while others focused on Olivia's role in the confrontation. Some people saw her as a victim of racial bias, while others accused her of overreacting and contributing to a situation that could have been handled differently. Olivia had spent the first few days in a daze, trying to adjust to the sudden attention, but now she found herself becoming more reflective. She couldn't help but read through the comment sections, even though she knew it wasn't helping her peace of mind. Some messages were supportive, but many were harsh. People were polarized, and that made Olivia wonder, was this what it meant to have a platform? She had never wanted to be the subject of a debate. She had just wanted to sit in the seat she had paid for. But now, her story was forcing others to confront uncomfortable truths. She began receiving messages from people who had experienced similar situations, stories of unfair treatment, of being judged based on assumptions, of being dismissed without explanation. It was both eye-opening and painful to realize how many people shared her experience, how often it went unnoticed, and how much those incidents were brushed off as one-off mistakes. Olivia was both humbled and overwhelmed by the responses. She had never considered herself an activist. She was just a person trying to get through life like anyone else. But now she realized how much her own small act of standing up for herself had resonated with others. In a way, her moment of frustration had tapped into something much bigger, a collective recognition of bias and inequality in public spaces. And while the whole ordeal had felt like an exhausting, personal battle, it had sparked something important, something that felt impossible to ignore. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the media buzz faded, Olivia found herself questioning the future. What next, she wondered. Her life had shifted in ways she hadn't expected. She had never sought this kind of attention, but now that it was here, Olivia realized she couldn't just let it slip away. The conversation had already started, and it was bigger than her. She had a choice: either let it fade into the background or use this moment to make a difference. She decided to take a step she never thought she would. Olivia reached out to a few organizations she had heard of, groups focused on racial justice, inclusion, and fair treatment in public spaces. She wasn't sure what she could offer, but the messages of support and shared experiences had left an impact on her. Maybe this was her opportunity to channel her energy into something meaningful, to raise awareness and help others feel seen. It wasn't the solution to all the problems, but it was a step. Olivia wasn't sure where this would lead, but she was beginning to see that her own journey, her own small act of standing up, could turn into something much larger than herself. Whether she became the face of a movement or simply a part of the ongoing conversation didn't matter as much as the fact that, for once, she had spoken up when it was needed. As Olivia navigated her new reality, things started to shift. The conversations around her began to take on a more nuanced tone. The initial debates, whether Sarah's firing was justified or if Olivia had overreacted, started to give way to deeper reflections about systemic issues and how often people of color, especially Black women, face discrimination in everyday interactions. Articles and discussions began to focus more on the root causes of bias and the uncomfortable truths that had been exposed. Olivia's experience had become a case study, a real-world example of how bias could play out in the smallest of moments, with lasting consequences. Olivia found herself invited to participate in discussions, both online and offline. She was hesitant at first, unsure of whether she was equipped to speak on such a complex issue. But when she started talking to people who shared their own stories, she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating space for others to share, to feel heard, and to bring awareness to the ways in which bias showed up in everyday life. One afternoon, Olivia took a deep breath and sat down to write a post for her social media account. She had never been one for public speaking or posting her thoughts online, but this felt different. She wanted to contribute to the conversation, to use her voice for something bigger. She started by sharing her experience, explaining how the incident had made her feel. Not just the frustration, but the humiliation of being questioned in front of others. The assumption that she didn't belong in a space that was rightfully hers. She spoke about the ripple effect it had, how it made her reflect on all the other moments in her life when she had been overlooked or underestimated, simply because of who she was. As she finished the post, she hesitated for a moment before hitting publish. The weight of her words felt heavier than she expected, but when the post went live, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life began to comment, sharing their own experiences, expressing solidarity, and thanking Olivia for speaking up. Some even shared how her post had inspired them to reflect on their own biases, to check the assumptions they made about others. It was a small ripple, but it was a ripple that Olivia felt could grow into something meaningful. Her post didn't solve everything. It didn't erase the pain or the discomfort she had felt on that plane, or the challenges that still lay ahead. But it was a step toward opening a door, one that led to a more honest conversation about how bias affects people in ways both big and small. In the weeks that followed, Olivia started to see a shift in the way people engaged with her story. What had begun as a controversial viral moment had now become a call to action for many. It wasn't about the flight attendant anymore. It wasn't about her seat. It was about the broader issue. How bias, whether conscious or unconscious, shaped people's lives, often in ways they didn't even recognize. Olivia realized that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. Weeks passed, and while the media frenzy had calmed, Olivia found herself at a crossroads. The conversations she had sparked about bias, race, and public treatment had only deepened. People were talking more openly now, sharing their own stories and discussing ways to address these issues. But Olivia couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. What had started as a personal experience had grown into something larger, something that she couldn't just walk away from. She couldn't ignore the fact that her story had resonated with so many others, and that made her realize something important. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about starting a shift, a way of forcing people to question the systems and assumptions that shaped how we all interacted with each other. Olivia's inbox was still full of messages, many from strangers who thanked her for speaking out, who told her that her post had given them the courage to speak up in their own lives. But amidst the support, there were still those who criticized her, some claiming she was making mountains out of molehills, others accusing her of exploiting the situation for attention. She had expected this. People who had never faced the type of discrimination she had wouldn't understand why it mattered. The arguments were tiring, but Olivia wasn't as affected by them anymore. She had come to realize that her story wasn't just about defending herself. It was about defending a larger truth. She couldn't change people's minds who weren't ready to listen, but she could continue to use her voice for those who needed it. As the weeks turned into months, Olivia began to focus on how she could turn this moment into action. She had been invited to speak at panels and events about racial justice, and although she had never seen herself as an advocate, she started to see the value in sharing her story. She was no longer just telling people what had happened on that flight. She was speaking to the larger issue, about how often people of color, particularly Black women, were made to feel like they didn't belong, even in spaces where they had every right to be. One day, after speaking at an event, Olivia stood outside the venue, reflecting on the journey she had been on since that flight. She had never imagined that standing up for herself in that moment would lead to such a whirlwind of experiences. The discomfort, the uncertainty, and the weight of it all had been overwhelming. But now, as she looked out over the city, she felt something else. She felt empowered. It wasn't about the flight attendant anymore. It wasn't about a single moment that had gone wrong. It was about what had happened after that moment. That small act of speaking out had created a platform for people to share their stories, to discuss the uncomfortable truths about how race and bias shaped their lives. Olivia had begun to embrace her role in this conversation, understanding that while her story was just one of many, it had sparked something. The discussions around racial injustice, bias, and equity weren't going to stop. The story had spread far beyond her, and now Olivia realized it was her responsibility to keep that momentum going. Whether it was through speaking engagements, social media, or just having conversations with people in her life, Olivia knew she had the power to continue making a difference. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. She was no longer just a passenger on a plane. She was part of something much bigger, a movement that in its own small way could begin to shift the culture. She wasn't sure exactly where this journey would take her, but she knew that she had a choice: to continue speaking up, to continue using her voice, and to continue challenging the biases that had too long gone unchecked. She had been part of a moment of change, and now Olivia felt ready to carry that change forward, no matter where it took her. Months passed, and Olivia's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The intensity of the media coverage had died down, but the conversations she had sparked were still going strong. The messages of support had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. Olivia had become an unexpected figure in the larger discussion about race, privilege, and equality. What had started as a singular moment in time, a simple act of standing up for herself on a flight, had transformed into a catalyst for broader conversations about systemic bias and discrimination. Olivia had taken on a new role, one that she hadn't planned for and didn't fully know how to navigate. She was invited to attend panel discussions and conferences, speaking about her experience and how it had opened her eyes to the ways in which subtle forms of discrimination played out in everyday life. She'd shared her story countless times, but now her message had expanded. She wasn't just telling people about what happened on the plane anymore. She was urging them to think critically about the assumptions they made and the biases they carried, often without realizing it. But the weight of it all wasn't easy to carry. There were days when Olivia felt exhausted, physically and emotionally. The responsibility of being a public figure, even in a small way, was something she hadn't anticipated. She often found herself questioning her decisions. Was she doing enough? Was her voice being heard in the right way? Was it even making a difference? One evening, after returning home from yet another speaking event, Olivia found herself sitting on her couch, staring at her phone. Her inbox was full of messages, invitations, and new opportunities. But the weight of it all felt heavy. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had poured into this new chapter of her life. She had been so caught up in fighting for others, in standing up for what was right, that she hadn't stopped to think about how this all affected her. There had been moments of self-doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was truly making an impact or just adding to the noise. She had been so focused on challenging the system, she had almost forgotten to take care of herself in the process. As Olivia sat there, the flickering light of her phone illuminating her face, she realized something. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers or always being the loudest voice in the room. It was about showing up, about continuing to speak out, even when it felt uncomfortable. It was about being part of something larger than herself, about using her experience to challenge the status quo and, hopefully, change a few minds along the way. But it also meant recognizing that her own journey wasn't just about the issues she was fighting for. It was about her, too. She had to take care of herself in order to continue doing the work she cared so deeply about. The realization was freeing. Olivia wasn't just a symbol for change. She was a person with her own struggles, her own growth, and her own life to live. And that was okay. It was okay to step back sometimes, to recharge, to reflect, and to prioritize herself when needed. She didn't have to be everything to everyone. She just had to keep being true to herself. With this newfound clarity, Olivia decided to take a break. She turned off her phone for a few days, giving herself the space to breathe and reflect. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to not be the face of a movement, not to be the one carrying the weight of other people's expectations. She spent the days in quiet solitude, reconnecting with herself, doing things she enjoyed, and spending time with close friends who reminded her of who she was before all the media attention. During this break, Olivia began to see her role in this conversation from a different perspective. She understood now that this wasn't just about sharing her personal story over and over. It was about listening, about creating a space for others to share theirs too. Her experience was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and while her story had sparked conversations, she also realized how important it was to listen to others who had been impacted by the same issues. There were so many voices, so many stories, all fighting for the same goal: equality, respect, and the ability to exist in spaces without being judged based on appearance, background, or assumptions. When Olivia returned to speaking engagements, her approach had shifted. She was still passionate about the issue, but she no longer felt like she was carrying the full weight of the conversation alone. She began collaborating with organizations that were working on racial justice, equality, and fair treatment in public spaces. It wasn't just about her experience anymore. It was about amplifying the voices of others, supporting the work that was already being done, and using her platform to help move the conversation forward. Her role had changed. She was no longer just a subject of the conversation, but an active participant in shaping it. She had learned to use her experience not just to advocate for change, but to build bridges, to bring people together, and to create more spaces for those who were often silenced. Olivia had always been someone who stood up for herself, but now she was learning to stand up for others in ways she had never imagined. Her journey had taken unexpected turns, and the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Olivia felt at peace with where she was. She had learned to balance the work she was doing with the self-care she needed. She had found her voice, and now she was learning how to use it in ways that would not only create change, but also nourish her own soul. As she looked ahead, Olivia knew that the fight for equality was far from over. There were still biases to confront, still assumptions to challenge, and still work to be done. But now she was no longer fighting alone. She had become part of something bigger, something that was changing, evolving, and growing every day. And Olivia knew that no matter what, she would continue to be a part of that change. Months later, Olivia found herself standing before a packed room at a national conference on racial equity. The room was filled with advocates, activists, and professionals from various industries, all gathered to discuss and address systemic inequality. It wasn't the first time she had spoken at an event like this, but this time felt different. She had changed. The journey she had been on since that flight had altered her perspective on both herself and the work she was doing. She had spent the last year working alongside organizations that focused on racial justice and equity, pushing for change within the systems that perpetuated discrimination. But Olivia had also taken time to reflect on her own life, her experiences, and her role in this ongoing conversation. She had learned that being part of a movement wasn't just about making noise. It was about listening, learning, and understanding the experiences of others. It was about creating spaces for people to share their stories, to empower them to speak out, and to amplify voices that had long been silenced. As Olivia prepared to speak, she looked out at the crowd before her. The room was quiet, expectant. She wasn't nervous anymore. She had become accustomed to sharing her story, to standing up for what she believed in. But tonight, the speech she had prepared wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about the broader issue, the biases that continued to shape the way people of color were treated in public spaces, and the collective responsibility to change that. She stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and began. "This past year has been a whirlwind, to say the least," Olivia began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What started as a simple misunderstanding on a flight led to something much bigger than I ever expected. It became a conversation about race, about bias, about the assumptions we make about each other every single day." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But what I've learned over the past year is that this conversation isn't just about one flight attendant, one incident, or even one person's story. It's about a system. It's about all the moments we don't see, the microaggressions, the biases, the assumptions that shape how we move through the world. And it's about all of us, each of us, taking responsibility for changing that system." Olivia took another breath, glancing around the room, meeting the eyes of the people in front of her. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be the face of this movement. But sometimes the work finds you, and when it does, you have a choice. You can either ignore it, or you can stand up. You can speak out. You can be part of the change." Her words resonated in the room, and Olivia felt a surge of hope rise within her. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about all the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or judged based on their appearance, their race, or their background. It was about the collective work needed to break down the biases that still had a chokehold on society. "I stand here today, not as a symbol, but as a person who has learned and grown from this experience," Olivia continued. "And I stand here as part of a much larger conversation, one that we're all responsible for continuing. This isn't a one-time issue. It's something we have to keep talking about, something we have to keep fighting for. Because change doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in conversations like this and in the work we do when the spotlight is off us. When we're not in the headlines but still doing the hard work of creating equality." The room was silent now, listening, absorbing. Olivia's voice grew stronger with each word. "This is our moment to make a difference. Not just for the people in this room, but for everyone who will come after us. We have a choice: to continue the conversation, to challenge our biases, to make the world a more inclusive place for everyone. We can't afford to be silent. We can't afford to ignore the issues that impact so many." She paused once more, the weight of her words settling over her like a quiet strength. This is just the beginning. But together we can create a world where everyone belongs, no matter what seat they're in." As Olivia finished her speech, the room erupted in applause. She stood there, feeling the energy of the room, the collective commitment to change. For the first time in a long while, she felt that her journey had come full circle, not because she had all the answers, but because she had become part of something larger than herself. She wasn't just the woman who had been refused a seat. She was part of a movement, and that movement was far from over. It was just getting started. After the event, Olivia found herself surrounded by people, each of them eager to shake her hand, share their own stories, or express their appreciation. It was humbling, and for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt like she was truly part of a larger community, one that wasn't just fighting for her cause, but for the causes of countless others who had been overlooked or underestimated. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't quite gotten used to. But it was empowering too. As she made her way through the crowd, Olivia couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride, not in herself necessarily, but in the work that was being done, in the change that was slowly taking root. People were talking about their experiences, sharing their challenges, and asking questions about how they could be part of the solution. It wasn't about grand gestures anymore. It was about everyday actions, the willingness to listen, to challenge biases, to acknowledge the things that often went unnoticed. One woman, a teacher from a nearby city, approached Olivia with tears in her eyes. "Your story, it really struck me," she said, voice shaking. "I've been teaching for years, and I never realized how many of my students might feel the way you did. How many of them might be silently struggling with the same issues. I want to do better for them. Thank you for showing me how." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. She had heard stories like this before, but something about this moment felt different. The woman wasn't just moved by the story. She was already thinking about how to apply what she had learned in her own work. It wasn't just a moment of awareness. It was a moment of action. Another man, an executive at a large corporation, pulled Olivia aside. "I've been thinking a lot about the privilege I have, especially in my position," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I can't imagine what it must have been like for you to be treated that way. I want to help shift the culture at my company, to make sure people like you, people of color, are treated with the respect they deserve and given the same opportunities. I don't have all the answers, but I'm committed to learning and doing better." Olivia nodded, grateful for his words, though she knew that the true challenge would be in the follow-through. It was easy to talk about change, but it was harder to make it happen, especially in environments where biases were so deeply embedded. But hearing this man acknowledge his own privilege and commit to doing better was a step in the right direction. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the crowd began to thin, Olivia found herself standing at the back of the hall, looking out over the empty seats. The lights were dimming, and the echoes of conversations were fading. She had made it through the day, through the speeches, the panels, the conversations, and as tired as she felt, she was also full of hope. She had spent so much of the past year questioning whether she was doing enough, wondering if her voice was truly making an impact. But now, as she stood there in the quiet aftermath, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't about the flight or even the viral video. It was about the long, hard work that had yet to be done. It was about every person who had shared their story, every organization working toward justice, every voice calling for change. Olivia had become part of something much bigger, and now, more than ever, she felt the weight of that responsibility. But she also felt the power that came with it. She wasn't alone in this fight, and neither were any of the people who had shared their stories with her, or the countless others who had been affected by the biases that still lingered in society. This was a collective movement, a movement that was growing stronger, gaining momentum with every conversation, every action, every voice that spoke up. Olivia had found her place in it, and as she left the conference that night, she knew that the work wasn't done. It would never be done. But she was ready to keep pushing forward, to keep speaking up, and to keep fighting for a world where everyone truly belonged. No matter who they were, no matter where they came from, no matter the seat they sat in. The road ahead was long, but Olivia was no longer afraid. She was ready. As the months continued to pass, Olivia's life took on a new rhythm, one that balanced her advocacy work with the quieter moments of reflection and growth. The momentum she had helped build around racial justice, fairness, and inclusion hadn't slowed. If anything, it was accelerating. Her name had become synonymous with standing up for what was right, but she had come to realize that her journey was never about fame or recognition. It was about the change she was helping to create, no matter how small or large. She kept speaking, kept working with organizations that focused on making public spaces more inclusive, and kept having conversations that challenged people's assumptions. But what was most rewarding now wasn't the attention. It was the real, tangible change she was seeing in her community and beyond. She had worked with schools to implement more inclusive curricula, helped corporations address unconscious bias in the workplace, and sat down with lawmakers to push for better policies that would hold individuals and institutions accountable for their actions. Yet, even as she became more deeply involved in the work, Olivia never lost sight of the importance of self-care. She had learned, through all the highs and lows of the past year, that in order to keep going, she had to be kind to herself. Advocacy was important, but so was rest, peace of mind, and the space to simply live without the pressure of always having to be a symbol for change. One day, sitting in a quiet cafe with a close friend, Olivia reflected on how far she had come. She realized that the girl who had boarded that flight, unsure of what was going to happen next, had transformed into someone who could stand in front of a room full of people and speak from the heart, without fear, without hesitation. She had learned that change wasn't a quick fix. It was a process, a slow, steady unfolding of conversations, actions, and reflections. I never imagined that one moment, one incident could lead to all of this, Olivia said, stirring her coffee slowly. But I also never imagined how much I'd learn about myself through all of it. Not just about the world, but about my own capacity for growth, resilience, and courage. It's been exhausting, but it's been worth it. Her friend smiled warmly, nodding. You've become part of something so much bigger than just yourself, Olivia. And through it all, you've stayed true to who you are. Olivia nodded, the weight of the last year finally beginning to settle comfortably in her heart. I've learned that it's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about showing up, speaking up, and doing the best I can. It's about acknowledging the small victories, the conversations, the changes, the shifts in perspective that happen quietly and over time. She took a deep breath, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long while. I've come to understand that we're all part of this change, in our own ways. It's not just about me anymore. It's about all of us, and what we do when we're faced with these moments that challenge us to be better, to do better. And the truth is, that's where the real power lies. Her friend reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. I think you've done more than you'll ever know. As Olivia sat there, looking out at the world passing by outside the cafe window, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been difficult, and at times, lonely. But now, as she reflected on everything she had learned and everything she had helped to inspire, she felt a quiet confidence settle in her bones. The road ahead would still have its challenges, its setbacks, and its doubts, but she knew, with certainty, that she was ready to face whatever came next. Because in the end, the work was never just about one flight, one incident, or one moment. It was about building a future where every person, regardless of who they were, where they came from, or what they looked like, could sit in any seat and feel like they truly belonged. And for Olivia, that was the ultimate victory. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means a lot.